I wasn't supposed to be in that Siberian cavern, but what I saw inside that sarcophagus still keeps me awake at night. I've worked on geological expeditions for most of my life, and I thought I'd seen it all. Frozen mammoths, ancient tools buried under meters of permafrost, and even the fossilized bones of creatures that predated human history by millions of years. But nothing could have prepared me for what we uncovered that day, and nothing could have prepared us for what came after. I need to tell this story now because the official reports will never see the light of day. You'll read the government-approved version, full of redacted names and empty conclusions, but the truth is buried in that ice, along with the thing we should have left alone. It started in the early weeks of December. The cold in Siberia was different from anything I'd experienced before. The air seemed to cling to your skin, freezing it raw within seconds, and the ground was so brittle under our boots that it cracked like glass. Our team had been hired by a private company to survey a remote site in the Yamal Peninsula, an area notorious for its permafrost craters and mysterious gas eruptions. Officially, we were there to map methane pockets that could pose a threat to future drilling projects. Unofficially, I was told the real purpose only after I'd signed enough non-disclosure agreements to bury me in lawsuits if I spoke a word. The higher-ups believed something strange was buried deep beneath the ice, a metallic anomaly picked up by geological surveys. They claimed it might be an ancient meteorite, but even then, something about the way they spoke told me they weren't being entirely honest. When we finally broke through the ice layer, we found it, though calling it a meteorite felt absurd the moment I saw it. The object was a massive metallic sarcophagus, lying horizontal as though someone had carefully placed it there millions of years ago. It wasn't jagged or irregular like natural formations tend to be. Its surface was impossibly smooth, glinting faintly under the halogen work lights we'd rigged up. It wasn't a natural metallic ore either. The alloy was unlike anything our equipment could identify. Strange etchings, symbols, ran across the surface in tight, angular patterns that no one could make sense of. One of the engineers joked that it looked like something from a bad sci-fi movie, but no one laughed. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken realization that this wasn't just another discovery. The thing was impossibly heavy. Even with all our equipment, it took hours to extract it from the frozen soil without damaging it. Once we had it under the lights, we could see that the symbols weren't just carvings. They almost seemed to glow faintly, pulsing as though they were alive. At first, we thought it was a trick of the light or the reflection of our lamps, but the glow remained even when we shut everything down. One of the technicians, Oleg, muttered something in Russian that I couldn't catch, but the tone in his voice was unmistakable. Fear. Oleg was the kind of guy who could joke through a tornado, but seeing him go pale told me everything I needed to know. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. By the second day, the unease among the team was palpable. People started reporting strange sensations while working near the sarcophagus, headaches, nausea, and a faint ringing in their ears. I dismissed it as exhaustion at first. We'd been working 12-hour shifts in sub-zero temperatures, but then Andrei, one of the drill operators, claimed he'd heard whispers while he was alone near the site. He swore he'd heard someone calling his name in a language he didn't understand. That same night, another crew member woke up screaming in his tent, clawing at his ears. He wouldn't tell us what he'd dreamed, only that he never wanted to go near the sarcophagus again. We tried to laugh it off, blaming the altitude and the stress, but deep down, we all felt it. Something was wrong. On the third day, the decision was made to open it. None of us had the authority to make that call, but we'd received a direct order from Moscow. Specialists had arrived, a group of men in uniforms that didn't carry any insignia but commanded authority in a way that left no room for argument. They brought with them equipment we'd never seen before: scanners, containment units, and tools that looked more suited for a laboratory than a remote Arctic dig site. Their leader, a man with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, gave us a single instruction: observe, but do not interfere. I remember asking why we were opening it at all. why we couldn't transport it to a secure facility first. He looked at me like I was a child and said, "Some things cannot be moved." When the lid finally came off, it didn't make a sound. It was as though it had been waiting for that moment, the way a flower waits for the sun. Inside was the figure. I don't know what else to call it. It wasn't human, but it was close enough to send a chill down my spine. Its skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over an elongated frame. Its skull was larger than it should have been, with deep sockets where eyes might have been if they weren't covered by a milky film. I remember thinking it looked fragile, almost peaceful, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. But then I noticed its hands. Thin, spindly fingers curled into unnatural shapes, as though it had died reaching for something. One of the specialists moved closer, shining a light over the figure's body. That's when we saw the scars. Thin, jagged lines crisscrossing its chest and limbs, almost as if it had been dissected and then carefully sewn back together. The symbols on the outside of the sarcophagus were etched into its skin as well, glowing faintly under the light. None of us spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the generators outside the cavern. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that we had crossed a line we didn't fully understand. The first incident happened hours later. One of the specialists collapsed without warning, clutching his chest. He was rushed to the medical tent, but he couldn't stop convulsing. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and his lips moved as though he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. I overheard one of the medics saying his body temperature had dropped dangerously low, despite the heated environment. Later that night, he was flown out by helicopter. We were told it was a cardiac episode brought on by the cold, but no one believed that, especially not after what happened next. That was when the whispers began for all of us. They weren't loud, not at first, just faint murmurs at the edge of hearing, like a distant radio tuned to a station. You couldn't quite catch. It didn't matter where you were, inside the tents, out by the dig site, even in the mess hall. You could hear them if you listened long enough. And the worst part? They weren't in any language I'd ever heard, but they felt familiar somehow, like they were meant for me. By the end of the week, people were talking about leaving, but the specialists wouldn't allow it. They had sealed off the site, posted guards around the perimeter, and confiscated all personal recording devices. They told us it was for our safety, but the way they watched us made it clear they didn't trust us, or maybe they were afraid of what we might do. The nightmares began to spread like a sickness. Every member of the team had their own version, dreams of endless corridors carved from ice, of shadowy figures standing just beyond sight, or of being trapped in the sarcophagus itself, suffocating in the blackness. We stopped talking about them after a while, but you could see it in each other's faces. No one was sleeping. It wasn't just exhaustion, though. Something had changed in that cavern, something we couldn't explain. I could feel it, humming just beneath the surface, like a radio signal you couldn't turn off. And it wasn't just the dreams. The whispers grew louder. They no longer faded when we left the sarcophagus behind. They followed us, threading through the walls of our tents, weaving into the static of our equipment. By the fourth day, we'd started losing time. It happened slowly at first. Someone would glance at their watch and swear that hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Then it got worse. People began blacking out. One minute they'd be working, the next they'd find themselves somewhere else entirely, with no memory of how they got there. Andrew was the first to go missing completely. He'd been assigned to monitor the temperature fluctuations in the chamber and was last seen entering the cavern with his clipboard tucked under one arm. When he didn't return after several hours, a search party was sent to look for him. What they found sent chills down my spine. His tools were still there, arranged neatly on the ground, coated in a thin layer of frost. But there was no sign of Andre. Not a footprint, not a sound. It was as if the ice itself had swallowed him whole. The specialists didn't seem surprised. That's what unnerved me the most. They sealed off the area where Andre had been working, ordered us not to speak about it, and carried on as if nothing had happened, but their eyes gave them away. Beneath the calm, calculated demeanor, there was a flicker of something I hadn't seen before. Fear. They were just as in the dark as we were, and whatever they'd been sent here to find, it was far beyond their control. I confronted one of them, a younger guy who looked more like a scientist than a soldier, and asked him what was really going on. At first he refused to answer. Then in a low voice he said, "This isn't the first one." Before I could press him, one of the others barked an order, and he snapped back to attention. But his words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. How many more of these things were out there? The equipment failures started that night. Lights flickered and dimmed, even though the generators were running at full capacity. Radios cut in and out, their static punctuated by faint, unrecognizable voices. One of the cameras we'd set up to monitor the sarcophagus began capturing strange anomalies, blurry, shifting shapes that seemed to hover around the edges of the frame. At first, we thought it was a glitch, but when we reviewed the footage frame by frame, we saw it. The sarcophagus was no longer completely still. The figure inside had shifted, ever so slightly, its head tilting toward the camera as if it were watching us. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't have to. Everyone felt it. The air in the cavern had changed, growing heavier, thicker, like trying to breathe underwater. And there was a smell now, faint but unmistakable, like metal and decay. One of the geologists, a quiet woman named Lena, refused to go back inside. "It's awake," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't you see? It's awake." The specialist dismissed her, chalking it up to stress, but I could see the cracks forming in their facade. They were running tests around the clock now, taking samples from the sarcophagus and the surrounding ice, muttering among themselves in clipped, urgent tones. I overheard one of them mention energy signatures, readings that didn't match anything on record. Another whispered something about electromagnetic interference, about patterns they couldn't explain. On the 5th day, we found the second body. It wasn't Andrei. This one was older, much older, mummified and frozen in the ice several meters below the sarcophagus. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its skeletal structure was similar to the figure inside the sarcophagus, but smaller, more primitive, as if it were some kind of precursor. The specialists were ecstatic, chattering excitedly about evolutionary anomalies and unprecedented discoveries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just uncovered a piece of something far bigger, a puzzle we didn't have the tools to solve. That night, the cavern came alive. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the air crackled with static electricity. The lights in the chamber flickered wildly before plunging us into darkness. I remember fumbling for my flashlight, my hands shaking, as the temperature dropped suddenly, biting through my layers of clothing, and then I saw it. A faint glow emanating from the sarcophagus, pulsing in time with the whispers. The figure inside was moving now, its chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. It shouldn't have been possible. Every test we'd run showed no signs of life, but there it was, stirring inside its metallic tomb, as though the ice had only been keeping it dormant. The specialist tried to calm us, insisting it was just a natural phenomenon, some kind of bioelectric reaction triggered by exposure to air, but their voices betrayed them. They were just as terrified as we were. One of them, the same young scientist who'd spoken to me earlier, pulled me aside and said, "You need to leave, all of you. This isn't containment anymore, it's contact." Before I could ask what he meant, he was dragged away by his superiors, his protests muffled by the growing hum in the cavern. The mini-climax came without warning. One of the researchers, a man named Victor, had been examining the new body we'd found when he started convulsing. He collapsed to the ground, clutching his head and screaming, his voice raw and guttural. It took 3 people to hold him down, but he wouldn't. "Stop thrashing," his eyes rolling back into his head. He was muttering something under his breath, a string of sounds that didn't make sense, but that sent chills down my spine all the same. And then he stopped, just like that. His body went limp, and for a moment we thought he was dead. But then he sat up, slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing, and his lips curled into a smile that didn't belong on his face. "Its prison is broken," he said, his voice distorted like it was coming from somewhere else. "And it remembers." The cavern erupted into chaos. People were shouting, scrambling to get out, but the air had turned thick, almost tangible, pressing down on us like a weight. The lights flickered again, and in those brief flashes of illumination, I saw something I'll never forget. The figure inside the sarcophagus was fully awake now, its milky eyes open and unblinking, fixed on us. Its chest rose and fell steadily, and its fingers twitched, curling into fists. We ran. I don't remember much after that, just the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven, as I stumbled through the snow. By the time I reached the surface, the cavern had gone silent again, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. Whatever we'd awakened wasn't going back to sleep. As I write this, I can still hear the whispers. They're faint, barely audible, but they're there, lurking at the edge of my mind, and I can't help but wonder, if this was just one sarcophagus, how many more are out there? How many more prisons have been broken? I didn't know what terrified me more, the fact that the sarcophagus was alive in some way we couldn't understand, or the realization that no one seemed to be in control of what was happening anymore. The specialists, the ones who had marched in with their equipment and authority, were unraveling. Their calm, detached professionalism had fractured into something closer to desperation. They held meetings deep in the cavern, speaking in hushed tones, while we, the so-called expendable field team, were left to our own devices. No one wanted to talk about what had happened to Victor. His body had been taken away that same night, loaded onto a helicopter that disappeared into the frozen darkness. The official explanation was a stress-induced seizure, but we all knew that wasn't true. You don't smile like that when you're dying. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew more insistent, no longer faint murmurs, but clear enough to feel like voices just over your shoulder. I wasn't the only one hearing them. I could see it in the others, the way they jumped at every sound, their eyes darting nervously around the camp. One of the researchers, Lena, broke down in the middle of dinner, screaming that the voices were inside her head, telling her things she didn't want to know. When we tried to calm her down, she slapped the bowl of soup out of my hands and grabbed me by the collar. "It's not dead," she hissed, her eyes wide with terror. "It's remembering." The specialists quarantined her after that, locking her in one of the supply tents under guard. I don't know what they planned to do with her, but I didn't see her again after that night. Someone tried to reassure me that she'd been sent back to Moscow for evaluation, but I didn't believe them. Nothing left this place, unless it was under strict supervision, and even then, it was as if the camp itself resisted anything being removed. Equipment failed at the worst moments. Radios emitted bursts of static instead of words. Even the helicopters seemed reluctant to land, circling overhead for far longer than necessary before touching down. By the end of the week, something strange began happening to the environment itself. The temperature dropped even further, but the ice near the cavern entrance started to melt. No one could explain it. It wasn't just the warmth of the equipment or body heat, it was like the ground itself was bleeding water. The meltwater formed shallow pools that reflected the cavern ceiling in eerie, distorted ways, creating an illusion of depth that made my stomach churn every time I looked down. I could swear I saw shapes moving in those reflections, shapes that didn't correspond to anything in the cavern. I wasn't the only one who noticed. One of the younger technicians, Pavel, stopped dead while we were walking to the site, staring down into one of the pools with a look of pure horror. When I shook him, he turned to me, pale and shaking, and whispered, "It's staring back." I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't answer. He just walked back to his tent and refused to come out for the rest of the day. That night, he disappeared. His bunk was empty and no one had seen him leave, though his boots were still by the door. The guards searched the camp and the surrounding area, but there was no trace of him. By morning, his boots were gone too. It didn't make sense. The snow outside was undisturbed, as if he had vanished into thin air. The specialist didn't address Pavel's disappearance, but I could see the tension in their faces. They were running out of explanations, and the situation was spiraling out of control. Their focus seemed to shift entirely to the sarcophagus, which was still pulsing faintly with that strange rhythmic glow. They brought in more equipment, machines that emitted high-pitched hums and beams of light that scanned the metallic surface. I overheard one of them mention bioelectric fields, energy patterns that didn't match anything they'd ever seen. Another muttered something about neural activity, but when I asked what they meant, they shut me down immediately. Whatever they were finding, they weren't going to share it with the rest of us. Tensions between the remaining team members were boiling over. There were arguments about whether we should stay or leave, whether it was even possible to leave. Some of us were convinced the site was cursed, that we were already marked in some way and taking it back to the outside world would only spread whatever was here. Others, like Oleg, were more practical. "We're nothing to them," he said one night, gesturing toward the cavern. "If things go bad, they'll seal the whole site and leave us here to rot. You think they care what happens to us? We're just witnesses they don't need." Oleg's cynicism wasn't far from the truth. The specialists had already begun restricting our movements, confining us to certain areas of the camp, and keeping a closer watch on our interactions. It felt less like a research expedition and more like a prison. We were expendable, and we all knew it. The whispers reinforced that feeling, growing sharper and more distinct with each passing day. I started recognizing patterns in them, fragments of words that almost made sense, but it wasn't in Russian or English or any language I'd ever heard. It felt ancient, primal, something that bypassed the mind entirely and burrowed straight into the gut. The mini cliffhanger came in the form of an earthquake, or at least that's what we thought it was at first. The ground beneath the cavern began to shake, a low rumble that sent tools clattering to the floor and cracks spiderwebbing through the ice. The lights flickered wildly, and for a moment, everything was chaos. I remember shouting for everyone to get out, to retreat to the surface, but the specialists didn't move. They were too focused on the sarcophagus, staring at their monitors with wide eyes as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing, and then it stopped. The shaking, the noise, everything. The cavern fell silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears like a vacuum. I turned back toward the sarcophagus and my blood ran cold. The figure inside was standing, not fully upright. It was still confined by the dimensions of the metallic chamber, but it had lifted itself partially, its head tilted upward as though it were looking at something far above us. Its milky eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and its spindly fingers were pressed against the inside of the sarcophagus, leaving faint trails of condensation on the surface. One of the specialists, a man whose name I never learned, took a step toward it, holding some kind of scanning device. Before he could get close, the lights cut out completely. In the darkness, I heard the sound of metal groaning, like the sarcophagus itself was straining against the weight of something immense, and then came the scream. It wasn't human. It was low and guttural, reverberating through the cavern and rattling my bones. I've never heard anything like it, and I pray I never will again. When the lights flickered back on, the sarcophagus was empty. The figure was gone. The specialist who had approached it was lying on the ground, his face frozen in a mask of pure terror. He wasn't breathing. The others rushed to him, trying to revive him, but it was too late. His skin was cold to the touch, as if all the warmth had been drained from his body. We didn't have time to process what had happened. The cavern began to collapse. chunks of ice and rock falling from the ceiling as the ground shook violently beneath our feet. We ran, scrambling over the uneven terrain, slipping on the pools of meltwater that seemed to ripple with an unnatural energy. I don't know how I made it out, but when I finally stumbled into the open air, gasping for breath, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been inside that sarcophagus was free, and it wasn't staying in Siberia. When the cavern collapsed, I thought it was over. I thought we'd escaped the worst of it, but the moment we stepped into the icy tundra, I knew I was wrong. The air had changed. It wasn't just colder. It felt alive, vibrating with an energy that made my teeth ache and the hairs on my arms stand on end. The whispers didn't fade when we left the cavern. If anything, they grew louder, more coherent, threading through the howling wind in a way that made no sense. It wasn't in my head anymore. I could hear it outside, circling us, as though the very air was speaking, and whatever it was saying wasn't meant for human ears. The specialists had us regroup near the camp, but the camp itself had changed. Tents were flattened, supplies scattered across the snow, and the generator lights were flickering like dying fireflies. No one wanted to admit it, but we all felt it. Something had come out with us. Something we couldn't see but could feel, brushing against the edges of our minds like a cold, wet hand. One of the guards muttered a prayer under his breath, his voice trembling. Another cursed and loaded his rifle, though what he planned to shoot at, I couldn't guess. We were like ants scrambling after someone had kicked over the hill, and the thing that had kicked it was watching us from just out of sight. Oleg was the first to snap. He turned on the lead specialist, the one who had been barking orders since the beginning, and grabbed him by the front of his coat. "What did you bring us here for?" he shouted, shaking the man so hard his hat fell off. "What the hell is this thing? Tell me." The specialist didn't answer. He just stared at Oleg with wide, glassy eyes, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. I realized then that he didn't have answers. He had never had answers. They had sent him here to poke and prod at something they didn't understand, and now it was too late. The argument was cut short by a sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deeper than any machine, more organic than any natural phenomenon, and it made the ground beneath our feet vibrate. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost unbearable. People covered their ears, shouting over the noise, but I couldn't move. I was staring at the horizon, where a faint light was growing, shimmering like a heat mirage against the endless white. The light pulsed rhythmically, matching the hum, and I realized it wasn't coming from the sun, or the camp, or any natural source. It was coming from below us, from the collapsed cavern. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever had been inside the sarcophagus wasn't just awake, it was calling to something, or someone. The specialists scrambled into action, setting up what little equipment hadn't been destroyed in the chaos. I saw one of them unpack a case containing a device I didn't recognize, something sleek and black with a series of glowing panels. He muttered something to the others about containment protocols and field stabilization, but the words barely registered. My focus was on the light, which was growing brighter by the second. It wasn't just light anymore. It had texture, depth, as though it were peeling back layers of reality to reveal something beneath. And then the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It pressed against my skull, filling the void with a weight that made it hard to think. I turned to Oleg, hoping for some kind of grounding presence, but he was staring at the light with an expression I couldn't read. His lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear, and his eyes weren't right. They were too wide, too bright, reflecting the pulsing glow like mirrors. "Oleg," I said, reaching for him, but he stepped back before I could touch him. "It's not for us," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "We weren't supposed to see this." And then he turned and started walking toward the light. I shouted for him to stop, but he didn't even look back. Two of the guards tried to grab him, but the moment they touched him, they recoiled as if they'd been burned. One of them stumbled back, clutching his hand, and I saw frostbite spreading across his fingers, black and brittle. Oleg kept walking, his steps slow and deliberate, until he disappeared into the shimmering haze. The hum intensified, vibrating through my chest, and the light flared, forcing me to shield my eyes. When it dimmed, Oleg was gone. The only trace of him was a series of footprints leading to the edge of the light and stopping abruptly, as though he had been erased from existence. Panic set in after that. People shouted, argued, some even tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The hum was everywhere now, resonating through the ground, the air, even the sky. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, something vast and incomprehensible pressing down on us. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, in the way my thoughts kept looping back to the same terrible realization. We had opened a door that was never meant to be opened, and something had stepped through. The specialists were frantically working on their containment device, but it was clear they didn't know what they were dealing with. One of them, the young scientist who had warned me before, caught my arm and pulled me aside. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, but there was a fierce determination in his expression. "You have to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "They won't stop it. They can't. This isn't something we can contain." I asked him what it was, what we had unleashed, but he just shook his head. "It's older than us," he said. "Older than this planet, maybe older than this universe. We thought it was a relic, a piece of history, but it's not. It's alive, and it's not alone." Before I could ask what he meant, the hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the light surged forward, consuming everything in its path. People screamed as it passed over them, their voices cutting off abruptly as they were engulfed. I felt it touch me, cold and hot at the same time, like plunging into icy water while standing in the heart of a fire. It didn't burn, but it left something behind, a lingering presence that crawled under my skin and settled deep in my chest. When the light receded, the camp was gone. The tents, the equipment, the people, all of it had been erased, leaving only the untouched snow and the faint outline of the collapsed cavern. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, until I heard the whispers again. They were softer now, almost soothing, but they carried a weight that made my knees buckle. They weren't speaking to me anymore. They were speaking through me. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty expanse of snow. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. The hum was gone, but the air still vibrated with a residual energy that made it hard to breathe. I thought about Oleg, about Lena, about all the others who had been taken. I thought about the sarcophagus and the thing that had been inside it, the thing we had let loose into the world, and I thought about the young scientist's final words, the warning he had tried to give me before the light took him too. It's not alone. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the snow where the camp used to be. Time had stopped having any meaning. My mind was running in loops, trying to process what had happened, what I had seen, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. The whispers were still there, faint and distant now, but constant. They no longer felt intrusive though, more like a background hum, a part of me I couldn't separate from. It was as if whatever had been unleashed from the sarcophagus had left something behind, an echo of itself inside my head. I wanted to believe it was over, that the nightmare had ended when the camp disappeared, but deep down, I knew better. The light wasn't a warning, it was a signal. I don't remember walking away from the site, only that my legs carried me until the horizon shifted and the faint outline of a nearby settlement appeared through the icy haze. When I stumbled into the village, frostbitten and half mad, they must have thought I was some lost traveler who'd wandered too far. They wrapped me in blankets, poured steaming tea into my shaking hands, and asked me where I'd come from. I couldn't answer. What could I have said? that I'd seen something older than humanity, something that had no place in our world, that I'd watched people vanish into a pulsing light and felt the weight of an intelligence that didn't belong here? No, I stayed silent. The truth wasn't something I could explain, not to them, not even to myself. I stayed in the village for a few days, regaining my strength, but the whispers never left. Sometimes in the dead of night, I'd wake to find myself standing outside, staring at the dark horizon as if waiting for something to appear. Other times, I'd see reflections in the frozen windows, shapes that didn't belong to me, flickering at the edges of my vision. The villagers must have noticed my unease because they avoided me, whispering among themselves when they thought I couldn't hear. I didn't blame them. I would have avoided me too. It was on the third night that I finally heard it, the thing I hadn't dared admit to myself. The whispers weren't just whispers, they were words. The language was unfamiliar, twisting, and alien, but as I listened, I realized I could understand it. Not in the way you understand spoken language, but deeper, like the meaning was being poured directly into my mind. It wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking through me. The words carried fragments of images, stars wheeling in impossible patterns, landscapes that defied physics, structures so vast and complex they couldn't have been built by human hands, and always the sense of something searching, reaching out across time and space for something it had lost, or something it was trying to find. That's when it hit me. The sarcophagus wasn't a prison, it was a beacon. Whatever had been inside wasn't meant to be contained, it was meant to be found. We'd uncovered it, thinking we were explorers on the edge of some great discovery, but we were just pawns in a much larger game. The thing inside wasn't ancient. It wasn't a relic of the past. It was a warning from the future, a fragment of something that had already happened, but hadn't happened yet. I know how crazy that sounds, but when you've seen what I've seen, reality starts to feel like an arbitrary line drawn in the sand, easily erased. I left the village before dawn, taking what supplies I could carry. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. The light from the sarcophagus had burned itself into my mind, and I could still see it when I closed my eyes, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a memory, it was a message, and I couldn't ignore it. The further I walked, the more the whispers began to coalesce into something clearer, a pattern of thought that wasn't my own, but was somehow connected to me. I started to remember things I shouldn't have been able to remember, places I'd never been, faces I'd never seen, events that hadn't happened yet. They felt real, but not like memories, more like possibilities. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The thing from the sarcophagus had touched me in some fundamental way, altered me, and now I was carrying a piece of it with me. Maybe we all were. The others who had been there, Oleg, Lena, the specialists, they hadn't just vanished. They'd been taken somewhere, drawn into whatever larger purpose the sarcophagus was part of. I wasn't sure if that made me lucky or cursed, but the weight of it was crushing. I reached the edge of a larger city a few days later, hitching a ride on a truck headed for the nearest train station. The whispers quieted as I got closer to civilization, but they never disappeared entirely. They were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting. I tried to avoid people as much as I could, but every now and then I'd catch someone looking at me strangely, as if they could sense something was off. I couldn't blame them. I could feel it too, like an invisible mark burned into my skin. Over time, I started to piece together the larger implications of what we'd uncovered. The sarcophagus wasn't the only one. That much was clear. The patterns in the whispers spoke of others, scattered across the globe, hidden in places no one would think to look. And they weren't just waiting, they were communicating. The thing inside the sarcophagus hadn't escaped. It had merged, become part of something much larger. a network of consciousness that spanned time and space. We'd triggered it, woken it up, and now it was moving, spreading, reaching out into the world. I think about that often, about what it means for the rest of us. We like to think we're the masters of this planet, that we understand how the world works, but the truth is, we're just scratching the surface. There are things out there older than we can comprehend, things that don't operate on the same rules we do, and sometimes, when we dig too deep, we find them. Or worse, they find us. Now, months later, I've secluded myself in a remote cabin in the wilderness, far from anyone who might ask questions I can't answer. The whispers have faded to a dull murmur, but they're still there, a constant reminder of what happened and what's coming. I know I can't escape it. The things we uncovered in Siberia weren't meant for us, but now that they've been woken, they're not going back to sleep. They're here, moving among us, and I can't help but wonder what they're waiting for. Every so often, I see strange lights in the sky, brief flashes of brilliance that disappear before I can get a clear look. They remind me of the light from the sarcophagus, and every time I see them, the whispers grow louder, more insistent, as if they're trying to tell me something, or warn me. I can't tell if the thing inside me is a curse or a gift, but either way, it's not letting go. And then there's the question that keeps me awake at night, the thought I can't shake no matter how hard I try. If this wasn't the first one, how many more are out there? And what happens when they all wake up? Hello, agents. Curious about the most famous and shocking UFO cases? My new ebook uncovers 51 encounters the government tried to hide. Find it in the pinned comment. And if you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe, and there's another one waiting for you right here.